Alors bonjour, bienvenue au point de presse sur le projet de loi sur l'eau propre des Premières Nations. We'll start it off just with a couple of remarks. There will be 5 people speaking. We'll start off with Ontario Regional Chief Glen Hare, with Chief Erika Beaudin from Cowessess First Nation, and then Minister Patty Hajdu, Minister Gary Anandasangaree, and Mr. Wilbert Marshall from the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, and then we'll be ready to take a couple of questions in both languages. Thank you. Chief Hare.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My chiefs that are with me here also, miigwech. First, I want to acknowledge the land of the Algonquins we're meeting on today, and those of us that traveled from a distance, the lands that we traveled over. So again, I want to thank all of us here today on a very, very special day. Special for us when we're talking about water. And to Minister Hajdu, she had tabled the bill, an act respecting water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nations lands. The AFN is confident that the proposed legislation addresses one of our most critical priorities as First Nations, ensuring safe and clean drinking water and adequate wastewater. The bill is the first of its kind to be introduced since the passage of the UN Declaration Act. It is designed to address the long-standing water crisis in First Nation communities across Canada and to ensure meaningful change. The AFN has worked diligently to ensure that legislation contains the necessary minimum requirements as articulated by First Nations. This involved expanding the bill's mandate to remove the restrictions and incorporate necessary financial, governance, and rights-based language reflecting the needs and perspectives put forward by First Nations across Canada. The development of this legislation is critical to the quality of life and self-determination of First Nations. The process of this bill is more than consultation. It reflects cooperation and true co-development, a two-way collaborative process. Currently, without legislation, there is no enforcement standards or regulations related to water, source water, and safe drinking water, and the wastewater in First Nations across Canada. There is also no recognition of rights to govern waters on First Nations land and no sustainable long-term funding mechanisms to ensure sustainable water and wastewater management. This has created systematic issues, putting the health and well-being of First Nations at risk every day. First Nations have the right to access safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, and a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. The urgency to address this has been stated for decades. Now is the time to enact legislation that aligns with the needs and perspectives of First Nations and will address long-standing water crisis in First Nations communities. The AFN is calling on all government partners to support this bill. It represents an opportunity for Canada to uphold the rights of First Nations and put an end to a decades-long struggle for the basic human right to water and sanitation. We must ensure that every First Nation individual, particularly families and children, have access to these essential services. This is one of my most important part of this whole thing, is water and our children. And those of us that do and do not know our remote communities, families, when we send our kids to school, when we have boiled water and don't use water, don't drink it, don't bathe in it, but we still have to send them to school. And when we get to these learning places and when the authorities, teachers see our children come to school dirty, that's exactly what they say. They call CAS and police and accuse our parents of neglect. So please, I ask again to all government officials to support this as much as possible because we want our kids clean just like everybody else and stop accusing our parents that we don't take care of our loved ones. So water is very important to our remote communities. So let's work together to ensure the success of this legislation, enabling First Nations to access safe, clean drinking water, adequate wastewater services, and ensure a sustainable and healthy future for our future generations. So with that, I say miigwech, and again, I want to thank you for a very important day to be sharing with us here today. Thank you. Miigwech.
Good afternoon. My name is Erika Beaudin. I am the Chief of Cowessess First Nation, Treaty 4 Territory. I would also like to first acknowledge that we are on these amazing homelands, and someone from Treaty 4, I acknowledge receivership of coming onto your homelands. Today is a historic day. It's a beautiful day. Our Creator tells us that every day is a beautiful day, but today I feel as though it is something special, because in the land that we live in this contemporary world, there are laws other than Creator's that must be acknowledged and followed. And it is a start, a beautiful start for all of us to work together with the covenant of treaty, our inherent rights as Indigenous people and all people who inhabit these lands, to work together for the cleanest, the safest water that all of us could drink. Whether it's on reserve or off, Indigenous people, Indigenous children deserve to be conceived, born, and die drinking clean water. I believe that today is historic, not only because the bill has been introduced, but because it is the start of that day where our children will be born with the regulations that are needed, that will be enforced, that we will have as Indigenous people in the future. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, bonjour, everybody. I want to thank everyone, all the partners that are with me, in particular Ontario Regional Chief Glen Hare, Chief Erica Beaudin, who you just heard from, Chief Lance Haymond from the AFNQ, Chief Wilbert Marshall from Podlatnik, and the co-chair of the Atlantic Water Authority. Of course, my colleagues, Minister Vandell, Minister Anandasangaree, P.S. Atwin, and I think and Terry Dogood as well. I think P.S. to the Prime Minister, right? Yes, okay, so I've got everybody's titles out of the way, and I too want to acknowledge that we are on unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin territory, and every time I say that, I remember, or I don't remember, I try to conceive of what it might be like to be forcibly removed from your homelands and from your territory. And so I want to thank the Algonquin people for letting us remain here today to do our work and to raise our families. We just did table Bill C-61, the First Nations Clean Water Act, and this bill reflects an immense amount of work, collaboration, and knowledge sharing from First Nations partners. And it's their work, their contribution, and their leadership that resulted in a bill that will protect clean water for generations, just as Chief Beaudin is predicting. And I want to thank everyone for their commitment to truthful conversations, which are not always easy. It's been an honor to do this work with you. First Nations made it clear that they must have the tools and the powers to protect their inherent right to clean water. And as you've heard, many First Nations have had this right interrupted or stripped from them through colonization. And this devastation of waterways has led to immense grief and suffering for too many generations. This is one of the first bills developed following the passage of the United Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Article 19 of the Declaration requires states to consult and cooperate with Indigenous peoples before adopting legislative measures that affect them. And this bill today is the first on a new path of lawmaking together. To get to this moment, Canada worked with First Nations, listened to diverse perspectives, went back to the drawing board more than once, and challenged its own assumptions, processes, and inherent control. Some partners shared with me their reflections of the process and how they could begin to see their voices present. This is the first law designed with such extensive partnership, and I hope it's a model that will get better with each successive piece of legislation. So what does this bill do? To understand the need for this legislation, we actually have to go back to 2012. That year, the Conservative Party under Stephen Harper tabled a law for First Nations on water that was immediately condemned and seen by First Nations for what it was: cynical, political, and useless. Even before it was tabled, First Nations asked for it to be repealed. The Assembly of First Nations led the call for the repeal of the Harper legislation, and through their extensive work, they identified 5 key issues. They said, to be effective, better law to protect water would need to do the following. 1, affirm First Nations' inherent rights to manage their water systems. 2, create the tools First Nations need to protect their source waters. 3, hold governments accountable to invest the funding needed for water infrastructure. 4, co-develop minimum standards for clean drinking water. And 5, support the creation of a First Nations-led water institution. And we took that feedback to heart, and accordingly, this legislation addresses those 5 areas. First, on source water. Right now, First Nations don't have the tools they need to protect or monitor the water flowing into their communities. And all too often, that means that water is silently contaminated or rendered unusable, creating unacceptable health and safety conditions along with grief and fear. Mikisew Cree Nation in Alberta knows this all too well. Last month, there was a 3rd spill upstream of communities at the Curl Mine. And according to Chief Billy Joe Takaro, people are scared to drink the water. The provincial government of Alberta refuses to acknowledge the failure of the regulator to protect the health of Mikisew people. In fact, a week after the 3rd spill, Brian Jean, a minister with the Alberta government, called the company's commitment to environmental protection top-notch. Un autre exemple de contamination de l'eau est celui de la communauté de Grassy Narrows en Ontario. Il y a plus de 50 ans, l'industrie a pollué l'eau avec de mercure et a laissé la communauté et le gouvernement gérer les dégâts. Aujourd'hui, 90% de gens ont des symptômes d'empoisonnement au mercure. Ça a un grand impact sur la santé et la vie de générations d'enfants. Trop d'histoires comme cela ont affecté la vie de générations entières. Ça peut être évité, mais les Premières Nations ont besoin d'outils pour y arriver. This bill creates essential tools for First Nations to better protect their communities. It establishes standards, regulations, supports monitoring, and seeks to bring all partners, federal, provincial, and First Nations, to the table to better protect water for everyone. The second key element in this bill creates a First Nations-led water institution. Expertise that is First Nations-led has been long needed and called for by partners. This tool is a large one, and it ensures that solutions to ongoing and future water challenges are by First Nations for First Nations. It supports the self-determination and expertise of communities, and it will ensure the tools needed to continue to protect water for generations to come. Thirdly, the bill commits the federal government to invest the appropriate and necessary funding to ensure First Nations water services are comparable to those off reserve. When our federal Liberal government took office in 2015, there were 105 long-term boil water advisories. Given the decade of neglect under the Harper Conservatives, this was not surprising, because it's difficult to keep water safe without equal funding for operating or equipment or infrastructure or training. And funding for operations was significantly below provincial levels, making it hard for communities to do that training and to retain their water operators. Since 2015, we've increased funding for water infrastructure by 150%. And the number of long-term drinking water advisories has gone down by 73%. And we've also worked together to prevent hundreds of short-term advisories from becoming long-term. Only 4% of First Nations communities are under a long-term water advisory, and there is a plan and a project team in place for every single one of them. On a fait beaucoup de chemin depuis 2015, mais il faut tout faire pour ne plus jamais permettre à ce système d'ignorer les Premières Nations. Ces projets de loi protègent un progrès durement acquis. Et il garantit que le gouvernement fédéral ne pourra plus jamais couper dans l'eau potable comme l'a fait M. Harper. Le travail qui a mené à ces projets de loi a été teinté d'amour et de détermination par les gens qui l'ont fait avancer. Les dirigeants des Premières Nations, des membres de communautés, des chefs et des experts ont tous poussé pour une loi forte qui ancre le principe de vérité, d'équité et d'autodétermination dans le droit canadien. The debate on this law will be vigorous, as it is for all proposed law, but I am looking forward to the continued inclusion of First Nations voices in the journey. I truly believe that the inclusion of Indigenous ways and wisdom will create a stronger, better Canada for all of us. Miigwech, Nyawan, Ekasani, merci, and thank you.
Good afternoon, bonjour. Je suis heureux d'être ici sur le territoire non cédé de l'Algonquin et des Anishinaabe pour parler de cette législation historique. Cette annonce d'aujourd'hui représente un élément essentiel de notre effort visant à rebâtir une relation de nation à nation. I want to thank the many Indigenous peoples who have continuously been working to ensure their waters are protected. It is their persistence that gives us hope for the future, a clean, healthy future where Indigenous peoples are stewards of their lands and waters. And I want to thank Chief Hare for starting us off in a very good way, Chief Beaudin, and the many other chiefs that are here today, as well as my colleagues Terry Duguid, Jenica Atwin, Minister Dan Vandell, and of course Minister Patty Hajdu and her team for the extraordinary work that they have undertaken to get us to this point. It is such a critical part of rebuilding our nation-to-nation relationships. We cannot move forward in our nation-to-nation relationships without putting the past mistakes and make them right. We created a system which alienated First Nations people from their lands and waters. We failed to recognize inherent human rights, including the right to clean water, while denying First Nations people to this right. You have a willing partner in this government to set this right for the good. I know it doesn't always feel this way, but clean water has been a very long fight for First Nations, and we're here today to correct the past wrongs. In 2015, we made a commitment to end boil water advisories. We made a lot of progress now, and now it's 96% of communities have clean water, but there's much more to do. Today, with this historic legislation, First Nations would get control back of their waters, including water flowing into their communities. This is what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples looks like in action. This legislation was co-developed. We're taking consultations seriously, but to the next level. We're listening and we're learning. There's much more to do with self-governing and modern treaty First Nations. However, this legislation lays a very strong foundation. Si nous sommes ici aujourd'hui, c'est grâce à la contribution inlassable des peuples de Première Nation. Ce combat une durée de décennies. We're here today thanks to the tireless advocacy of First Nations people. It has been a decades-long fight. It's another step in redressing the wrongs of the past, and I look forward to the speedy passage of this legislation. And I want to conclude by quoting my predecessor, Mark Miller, who said that we have unpaid bills, and this is one of them. And we can only begin to talk about the path forward towards reconciliation when we pay those bills. Thank you, Miigwech.
My name is Chief Marshall from Woodland First Nations. I'm also the chair of the First Water Authority in Canada. On behalf of Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Minister for the invitation to witness the introduction of renewed safe drinking water legislation in the House of Commons. I am the chair and board of the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority, the first First Nations owned and operated water utility in Canada. As a utility, we have to take responsibility for delivery of our water and wastewater services on behalf of our member communities and significant steps in self-determination. The Water Authority represents progress, innovation, long-term solution for water and wastewater issues that affect our member First Nation communities. We provide the common standard of water and wastewater treatment along improved management and increased resources to deal with long-standing water challenges faced by Atlantic First Nations. For our people, water is important traditional and cultural value, a critical part of our communities in Canada. Safe drinking water is a fundamental human right. The right is not always attainable by First Nations communities. Progress is not possible if we can't depend on water coming out of our taps. And yet, in 2023, there was no formal national legal framework or regulatory regime to protect our people. That said, the Water Authority ahead of the curve, we created our own regulatory standards and our guide operations ahead of legislation framework of formalizing them. The work was completed in recognition as we utility must operate in high standards in our land and provide the best quality of water to our people, and return the highest quality influence back to our environment. The authority is happy to the legislation introduced today enables the Water Authority to formalize the standards we developed and empowers the First Nations across Canada to develop their own regulatory standards. While there is still work to be done, Atlantic First Nations Water Authority is supportive of the introduction of this legislation. It truly believes it is a step in the right direction and a unique opportunity for First Nations to take control of their service, critical and socioeconomic, environmental, and well-being of our communities. We also look for providing testimony on committee to our referring to our legislation ensure works of First Nations across Canada. Not alone do the talk, but she's doing a walk also. Ms. Hajdu, when I first met her, I gave her a really hard time. She'll tell you that. But thanks to Minister Miller also, before her, and also Minister Bennett. Our people don't really trust the government, any government. And actually, I'm here today, so that makes that's a lot for me to come here to be on her side today. And I'm very grateful. We're very thankful, our communities in Atlantic, for being here and doing this. It's a step in the right direction. And I think more of us, and if we could help other First Nation communities with their water, we're here to help also. And this is the first time ever we asked for the money we asked for. We actually got the whole thing. And I couldn't argue about it, so, you know. And she, like I said, she just didn't do the talk, she did the walk. And I'd like to thank her personally, and thank you very much. And thanks. I know. Thank you.
Right, we'll be ready to take some questions, so please identify yourself before, and we'll go with the main question and a follow-up question, please.
CBC News. So your government says that this bill gives First Nations control over drinking water. Does that mean that First Nations will be responsible for any issues that come up with drinking water, so that they will be legally responsible and that your government will no longer face lawsuits over this?
Well, what this bill actually does is provides the tools for First Nations to have the control, the inherent control over their water, but it actually enshrines in the legislation a responsibility of the federal government to be an active partner in the appropriate level of funding that will ensure that success. And so I think that's why you're hearing feedback from First Nations people that this legislation goes leaps and bounds further than the previous legislation, where the previous legislation imposed the responsibilities without the appropriate levels of support. I would say that, it is in everyone's interest that we protect the water here in Canada that feeds First Nations, that is on First Nations, and we're looking forward to that continued work together.
So who's legally responsible if there are issues going forward, Ottawa or First Nations?
Well, as I said, the law provides all of the tools necessary for First Nations to have the inherent control, but also an active partner in the Government of Canada to ensure that First Nations have the resources they need to deliver that water in a safe way and in a sustained way for generations to come.
Here from the Canadian Press. First Nations in BC and Alberta are saying that they weren't consulted on the bill. Do you commit to releasing a list of the nations and groups that were consulted to make this legislation come to life?
Well, what I can tell you is that all First Nations communities received 2 consultation drafts, one early draft and then a second consultation draft later on after we had made some changes based on the feedback on the first. First Nations had a number of different opportunities to feed into the legislation, and the consultation isn't over. The bill will be working its way through the House, and there will be active participation of First Nations in the committee process, through the debate process, and working with opposition parties. And the final commitment is amendments that are proposed to the government will be vetted with the First Nations partners who have been working so diligently on this law. So the ongoing consultation will continue, and I look forward to hearing feedback from all First Nations.
And part of the bill says that First Nations and provinces and territories can come together to work on a best case solution about how to protect water. How do you expect First Nations and these other jurisdictions to come together and protect the water when I think that their ideas of conservation, are often different than the First Nations. Like, how do you plan to get rid of those challenges and tensions?
You're talking about the collaboration with provinces and territories. Well, first of all, I would hope that provinces and territories want to protect source water, not just for Indigenous communities, but for all communities. This is pressing, it's really the issue that so many provinces and territories are facing as the onslaught of climate change has created unpredictability in climate patterns. You know, out in Saskatchewan, speaking to chiefs about the drying up of aquifers, the complaint is the same when you speak to Saskatchewan farmers. So there's an opportunity here for First Nations people to teach provinces and territories how better to work together to make sure that we can protect that source water for the generations to come. The government will support those consultations and that collaboration, and I would expect that there'll be a vigorous participation by provinces and territories.
Minister, Brett Forster with CBC Indigenous, thanks for taking our questions. Why has this taken 8 years to get a bill on this when your government promised to tackle clean water as a priority in 2015?
Well, first of all, I would start with the incredible work that First Nations and the Government of Canada have done to lift the incredible number of boil water advisories that were in place when we were first elected in 2015. And you heard me in my speech give you some data points. I mean, you know, well over 100 boil water, 140 boil water advisories to date that have been lifted in First Nations. And that's heavy lifting. Over $7 billion has been spent on First Nations water infrastructure and operating deficits. But I will say that the process of co-developed legislation is not as speedy, especially at this point where we have not actually experienced this in this country. You know, I think back to an earlier time when I was very eager to introduce this legislation in the House, but it wasn't good enough yet. And First Nations partners told me that. When I talk about open, difficult conversations, it can often feel challenging as the minister who's feeling pressured by a democratic cycle that can feel sometimes like you only have weeks or months to get something done. But what First Nations people told me repeatedly was they would rather have the legislation right and strong than fast. And I listened to those voices. And so we worked together diligently to make sure we landed at a place today where I think you hear many people are proud of the work.
On that exact note, Minister, your government promised to lift all long-term on-reserve boil water advisories by 2021 and did not deliver on that promise. So why should First Nations people trust your government to get it right this time?
Well, maybe I'll take a crack at that, and then I'll turn to anyone who wants to answer, and if you don't, that's okay as well. But I will just say, first of all, that level of ambition was incredibly important. And I will say that no Prime Minister before the Prime Minister that we have now, Justin Trudeau, made that commitment to First Nations. And I'm not sure that the federal government at that time, or at least the Liberal Party at that time, truly understood just how challenging that piece of work was going to be. But when we took office, we got to work. And that's the great thing about a stretch goal. When you actually have a goal, you can actually start to chart some progress against that goal. And so I am extremely proud of the work that we've done and the investments we made, 150% more, by the way, than the Harper government invested in clean drinking water, in infrastructure repair, in infrastructure replacement. And every one of the remaining 28 boil water advisories is either under construction, has a plan being developed, or is ready to have the Chief and Council lift that water advisory when they feel that it's safe to do so.
On that?
Well, I guess a number of us were ready to move forward on this, and I hear your question. But we also, we weren't ready a couple of times here, and we asked for an extension from the government, and we got it. And, you know, I got to rely on our legal people too, and not only that, but our rights holders too. And they wanted some things in this document. I was disappointed a few months ago when it got delayed again, and it got delayed the second time. But now we're here today, and I want to feel and believe we can do something positive now. And it's with the support of the people, not Glen, not the minister, but they asked for a delay, and we got it, and we did a lot of good work since then.
My community was one of them on a boil order way back, I forget how many years ago. For 40 years, we had a boil water advisory. We did get a new new water plant now, thanks to the new government here a few years ago, and we're not on a boil order no more, which is really good. That's how we started the Water Authority. I was one of the key people to start the Water Authority in Atlantic, but nobody wanted, I could show you a picture of our water. It was black as your pants. It came right out of our tap. And so, it's just, you couldn't shower, you couldn't brush your teeth, you couldn't wash your clothes. If your pipes were copper in your house, they disintegrated. It just went off like a sprinkler system. Anyway, we found out later on, and there was so much manganese and iron in our water, it was way above like hundreds. Like I forget what it was. It was an astronomical amount. Like it was crazy. So we started talking. I think it was Mark Miller way back then. I started talking to, and we got our new treatment plant at home. And now we're working on sewer also. Now we want to lead the way with our sewer to make it the water come out of the streams a lot clean, like you could actually drink it. I wouldn't drink it, but anyway. Also, I'd like to, I know they brought the legislation not that long ago. We threw it back at them and said, no, this is not good enough. So they went back, and that's what it came up today. So anyway, thanks.
I think about that word equity. And yesterday morning when I was on my way, I put down tobacco on the land that my mushum, my grandfather, deceased now, he was a World War II veteran, fought for the rights of all Canadians for 7 years overseas, and came back and couldn't leave the reserve without permission. I think about as I was praying and I put down that tobacco, I thought about as a child, I'm 52 years old now, and we drank water out of the well, and then we were able to drink water out of the tap. We are no longer able to do that. And I think about what the need is for service and equity. And so over 70 years later, my grandfather, who went to go fight for all Canadians and the safety of all Canadians, which for us is the inherent right, the treaty right of water, it is an honor now to come here and to be part of a historic day in which we may not have a piece of legislation that is perfect, but what we have is more than a start. And we have something that is more along the lines of the covenant of treaty that I spoke about before, not made just by First Nations, not made just by government, but made together. And that is what is important in moving forward, and that is what we're looking for. So are the expectations still the same? Absolutely. Will we get there? Absolutely. Will it probably take longer? Absolutely. But I firmly believe we will get there. Thank you.
Hi, Alessia here again. My question is for the minister. We're hearing throughout this press conference now that there were some hurdles that the government and First Nations had to jump through to get to this point, and you mentioned it's the first piece of legislation developed under UNDRIP. What lessons are you bringing from your experience here to your colleagues who are drafting legislation that impacts First Nations people?
Well, just to be clear, as the minister responsible for working on this legislation, I also worked with the entire team of ministers, including through the cabinet and with the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister. And I think the lessons that I have taken from this is first of all, that the system has inherent control in itself, that the bureaucracy itself is designed around control, and that if we truly want to work with First Nations to co-develop or to approach co-development, that we have to challenge all of our assumptions as ministers, as civil servants, as bureaucracy, about the secrecy of development, about how we share information, how we share draft legislation, and how we do so in a way that respects parliamentary privilege. And so each one of those hurdles was a hurdle, and we had to talk it through and figure it out. But that's what responsible governments do, especially governments that are committed to reconciliation. They push themselves to look in all those nooks and crannies where all the control lives and ask, why is it that way? And could we do it in a different way? And it requires a lot of pushing and persistence and vigor, and I'm really proud of all of my colleagues who did that work.
To speak to Lily Suey, who's the water treatment operator from Northwest Angle 33 First Nation today. She says that she's already following Ontario's guidelines. So what she's looking for in this bill is more resources for water operators, more water operators in First Nations, more funding. How will this bill address that?
Well, it's a great question. In the legislation, there is a phrase that talks about meet or beat. So First Nations communities will have regulations that will either meet the regulations of the comparative province or territory that they're in, or beat those regulations. So the first part is that's great news. So she's at the Ontario level of regulations. And the second news is that this legislation, as I said, affirms a funding path that is built on equity. So what I'm sure that water operator is reflecting on is that for decades, First Nations did not receive the same amount of money as compared to a non-Indigenous community of that size to provide clean water in terms of operating dollars, maintenance dollars, training dollars. We've changed that under our government, but this bill would put that into law and make it a forever commitment of Canada that equity for First Nations water protection is there until time immemorial.
So are you saying that water treatment operators will be paid the same amount as in First Nations as they are in municipalities?
First Nations authorities pay their own staff members, but they will, through this law, have the sufficient funds to be able to provide similar services as to non-Indigenous communities of that size.
Under this bill, that First
This bill
Nations will
commits to
have the money they need to run?
It commits to the equity of First Nations to have sufficient funding compared to non-Indigenous communities, and the funding frameworks will be worked out with First Nations people, so in full transparency, so they see how those calculations come to be.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.